Nobody understood what they were hearing at first. The sound did not match the morning. It did not belong to the usual rhythm of Central Park where footsteps, birds and distant traffic blended into a familiar hum. This sound was different. It carried emotion that felt too deep, too personal to be background noise. People slowed without realizing why. Some stopped walking entirely. Others turned their heads carefully as if afraid the sound might vanish if they moved too fast. A voice rose through the cold air, steady and warm, cutting through everything else. At first many assumed it was a recording. New York was full of surprises and illusions. Some thought it was a street performer with rare talent. A few laughed quietly at the impossible idea forming in their minds and pushed it away. But as people moved closer, something undeniable began to settle in their chests. Breath fogged in the winter air between verses. Fingers pressed firmly into guitar strings. Emotion moved across her face with each lyric. This was not a trick. This was not imitation. This was real. Taylor Swift was standing in Central Park singing like she had nowhere else to be. There was no stage beneath her feet. No microphone amplifying her voice. No security team scanning the crowd. No announcement drawing attention. Just a woman in a simple coat and wool hat holding a worn acoustic guitar and singing as if the world had narrowed to this single moment. The city slowed around her. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder without speaking. Something sacred was unfolding and no one wanted to break it. Some people recognized her immediately and froze in disbelief. Others felt something familiar without knowing why. The voice they had heard through car speakers late at night and through headphones during heartbreak was now filling open air, meant for anyone willing to stop. It felt intimate and vulnerable in a way stadiums could never be. By the time the sun would disappear behind the trees, this moment would become legend. Videos would spread across the internet faster than anyone could control. Headlines would praise the generosity. $50,000 would be raised for struggling street performers. But in these first minutes none of that existed yet. There was only a voice reminding people what music was meant to do. Taylor had woken before dawn that morning with a heaviness she could not explain. Her apartment was silent and the city outside still half asleep. Success surrounded her, awards, tours, recognition, yet something inside felt unfinished. She sat by the window holding a warm mug, watching the sky slowly change color, and felt a pull backward through time. She remembered being young and unknown, singing anywhere that would let her stand. Parking lots, cafes, open mics, empty rooms. She remembered cold hands shaking slightly as she tuned her guitar. She remembered the fear of being ignored and the quiet hope that someone might listen. Back then music was not about perfection. It was about survival. Fame had come later, and with it protection, distance, expectations. Crowds were massive but moments were controlled. Applause was loud but predictable. Somewhere along the way she had lost the closeness she once lived for. That realization sat heavy in her chest that morning. She opened her guitar case and lifted the instrument that had been with her long before the world knew her name. The wood was worn smooth by years of travel and use. This guitar had absorbed her fears and dreams. Holding it grounded her. The decision formed fully and clearly. She would return to the streets not as an icon but as a musician again. She dressed simply, pulling on boots and a coat, hiding her hair beneath a wool hat. She left without telling anyone. No cameras followed. No assistants questioned her plan. She stepped into the cold morning air feeling strangely free. The city moved around her unaware. People rushed to work, checked their phones, drank coffee and lived ordinary days, not knowing they were about to walk into something unforgettable. Central Park greeted her with quiet paths and bare trees. The sounds of the city softened as she walked deeper inside. She noticed street performers preparing for another uncertain day. Some tuned instruments with numb fingers. Some stared at the ground, already tired. Some laughed, trying to hide worry. These were people who trusted strangers every day just to survive. Taylor felt a familiar ache in her chest. Near Bethesda Terrace she chose a spot where sound traveled gently through open space. She placed her guitar case on the ground and inside it taped a handwritten note explaining that every dollar would go toward a fund created to support street performers and artists living on the edge. Her hands trembled slightly as she tuned the strings. It had been years since she felt this exposed. Years since music felt like a risk again. She took a breath and began to sing. The first notes were quiet, almost hesitant. People passed by without noticing. Then one person slowed. Another turned around. Coins dropped softly into the case. A few bills followed. Taylor kept her eyes lowered, letting the music speak before her identity could. Her voice carried warmth against the cold and people felt it before they understood it. A man removed his headphones, confused by the pull in his chest. A woman stopped walking and closed her eyes. A child tugged at a sleeve, asking who that was. The crowd formed slowly, naturally, without announcement. Someone whispered her name, uncertain. Another shook their head, refusing to believe it. Taylor sang as if she were 16 again, singing because she needed to. Each lyric carried honesty without polish. The park listened. Then she sang a chorus the world had memorized. Recognition moved through the crowd like electricity. Gasps spread outward. Hands flew to mouths. Phones rose into the air, but gently, almost respectfully. A teenage girl covered her face and cried without sound. Someone whispered, "It is really her." The moment did not explode into chaos. Instead it deepened. Shock turned into reverence. Taylor smiled softly and continued singing, grounding the moment in music rather than spectacle. Applause followed, but it was full, not loud. When she spoke, her voice was calm and real. She thanked everyone for stopping and explained why she was there. She spoke about street performers being the heartbeat of cities. About artists who give beauty to strangers while struggling to survive. She said this fund was for them. She said music belonged to everyone. She kept playing. Minutes stretched into something timeless. The cold faded into the background. She sang songs that unlocked memories and songs no one had ever heard. She shared stories about rejection and belief, about standing alone hoping someone would listen. People stayed longer than they planned. Strangers spoke like old friends. Something human bloomed in the middle of the park. Street performers from other paths gathered, drawn by sound and spirit. A drummer joined softly, testing the rhythm. A saxophonist added breath and warmth. A violinist stepped closer, hands shaking with gratitude. Taylor welcomed them all with nods and smiles. There was no hierarchy, only shared space. The park transformed into something intimate and alive. Children danced without rhythm. Elderly couples held hands. People forgot the time. Money filled the guitar case slowly, steadily, until it could no longer close. Some gave large bills. Some gave coins. Every offering carried intention. A man in a worn coat approached, hesitating. He pulled folded bills from his pocket, worn thin by use, and placed them carefully inside the case. His hands shook. He whispered thank you and stepped back, wiping his eyes. Taylor met his gaze and nodded, understanding without words. The sun began to shift, casting longer shadows through the trees. The air felt charged with something hopeful. This was only the beginning. As the morning stretched into mid-morning, the crowd around Taylor grew without any plan or direction. People who had been walking quickly stopped to watch. Others who had been sitting on benches listening quietly now moved closer, instinctively drawn by the music. A young man carrying a skateboard leaned against a tree and stared. A woman holding a coffee cup dropped her change into the case with shaking hands. Nobody shouted or demanded attention. They were there because something in the air felt sacred. Taylor's fingers danced across the strings as her voice grew stronger. She sang songs she had written in quiet rooms at home, songs no one had ever heard, songs that felt like secrets finally given to the world. Between songs she spoke softly, explaining stories of small shows and empty rooms, of nights when she wondered if anyone would ever notice. She said that music was a gift and that artists should never be afraid to share it even when the world seemed indifferent. People listened in silence or murmured softly, agreeing with her words. A few performers began to emerge from the edges of the park. A drummer set up his kit on a folded blanket and began playing gently. A violinist tuned her instrument nervously and joined a few steps behind. A saxophonist played low and warm melodies. Taylor nodded to each of them, welcoming them to the space. The music layered itself naturally, building something alive and unplanned. Nobody in the park knew it yet, but they were part of something extraordinary. Children wandered closer, laughing quietly as they listened. Some tried to dance awkwardly to the rhythm. Elderly couples stood holding hands, feeling the warmth of the music fill their hearts. People who had come for a walk or a morning jog now stayed frozen, captivated by the harmony forming before their eyes. Taylor's eyes scanned the crowd, noticing faces full of wonder and disbelief. She smiled to herself because this was the moment she had been waiting for all these years. Time lost its meaning as Taylor continued to play. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting soft golden light across the terrace. Every note and lyric carried hope and honesty. Coins clinked into the guitar case occasionally, but people gave quietly. Some held back longer than they wanted, testing the honesty of the moment. A man in a worn coat approached slowly, hesitated, then placed a folded bill inside the case before stepping back and watching. His eyes glistened with tears. Taylor looked up and nodded at him as if to say she understood everything he had felt. Performers who had gathered now played in gentle synchrony with her. The drummer added rhythm without overpowering. The violinist's strings carried melodies that twisted beautifully around Taylor's chords. The saxophone breathed into the space, creating a sense of warmth that spread through the crowd. Strangers exchanged glances as if they had known each other all their lives. The park became a temporary home for people who might otherwise never have met. Some people in the crowd recognized Taylor immediately. Whispers started softly at first and grew steadily louder, but nobody shouted. They spoke in awe, telling friends quietly that it was her and marveling at her humility. Others did not recognize her but felt a deep connection anyway. The honesty in her voice cut through noise and distraction and made every listener feel seen. The songs changed from quiet, reflective pieces to melodies that invited memories. People began to sway unconsciously. Mothers held their children closer. Some people closed their eyes and let tears roll down their cheeks. Taylor watched and smiled softly, feeling the energy flowing between her and the crowd. She realized that this was more than music. This was trust and vulnerability shared in a way that only a true moment of honesty could create. Minutes became hours and the sun started to dip low, casting long shadows across the terrace. Taylor's voice did not falter. She sang songs of hope, songs of struggle and resilience. Each verse was met with gentle applause and murmurs of encouragement. The performers around her became family. They laughed softly in between songs and nodded at each other in unspoken understanding. The connection between them was growing into something that would last far beyond this day. As the crowd thickened, people began to place more into the guitar case. Some small coins, some larger bills. Every donation felt meaningful. Taylor's heart swelled seeing people give not because of fame but because they felt inspired and moved. Every coin and every bill carried stories. Every hand that reached into the case was a small act of trust and hope. At one point a young girl no older than 10 walked up nervously carrying a folded note with a few coins inside. She whispered thank you quietly and Taylor knelt down to smile at her. She said softly that her gesture mattered more than she would ever know. The girl beamed and ran back to her mother. Moments like this made Taylor feel the purpose of what she was doing even more deeply. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of music across the park. Birds stopped chirping to listen as if the world itself had paused. People stopped taking photos or videos to simply be present. Conversations ceased. There was nothing but music and shared human emotion filling the air. Taylor felt her heart lift and realized that the simplest intentions could create the strongest impact. This was no longer just a performance. It was a living story unfolding in real time. Every note added to the narrative. Every gesture from the crowd became part of it. Even the cold air seemed warmer as it passed over everyone. Taylor smiled gently, closing her eyes, briefly feeling a sense of completeness she had never experienced on stage or in arenas. The time approached late afternoon and Taylor began preparing for the final set. She looked around at performers and crowd alike. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath in anticipation. Some whispered prayers quietly. Others simply watched with wide eyes. Taylor took a deep breath and began singing songs that carried the weight of her own journey and the journeys of every artist struggling in silence. The crowd held on to every note. Silence became the partner to her voice. Some cried openly. Others smiled softly, remembering moments of hope and hardship in their own lives. The energy in the park was palpable. Even people passing by at the edges slowed down, unconsciously drawn into the magic. The city seemed to acknowledge her presence and honor the music in its own quiet way. By the time she finished the final verse, the guitar case was nearly full and the air was charged with anticipation. People clapped softly but persistently. They were not applauding for fame. They were applauding for honesty, courage, and shared vulnerability. Taylor nodded gratefully, taking in every face and remembering the simple beginnings that had led her here. As the late afternoon sun began to sink behind the trees, the energy in Central Park felt almost sacred. The crowd had grown thicker and people moved closer, instinctively drawn by the music and the honesty in her voice. Taylor's fingers traced the strings of her guitar, gently coaxing melodies that felt alive. Every note seemed to breathe in the cold air and echo across the park. Performers around her had fallen into rhythm together, creating something organic and real. The saxophone softened to a gentle whisper. The violin danced lightly around the chords. The drum tapped slowly and purposefully. It was no longer a solo performance. It was a community woven together by sound and trust. Taylor paused briefly between songs and looked at the faces before her. Children had stopped playing and held hands with parents. Elderly couples stood still, gripping each other's fingers. People who had been walking dogs earlier in the day now sat on benches, watching in awe. Even the strangers at the edges of the park were frozen, momentarily caught in the gravity of the music. Taylor spoke softly, reminding everyone that this was about the artists, about the people who give the world beauty without asking for much in return. Her words sank deep into the hearts of those listening. A few performers approached the case shyly. They whispered thanks as they added coins and bills. Taylor smiled at each of them, nodding and expressing gratitude without speaking loudly. The rhythm of generosity became part of the music. Every act of giving carried meaning beyond monetary value. It was a symbol of acknowledgement and hope. The crowd could feel the weight of it. They were not just spectators, they were participants in something extraordinary. The sun lowered further and the shadows grew long. Taylor strummed a gentle chord and began a song she had written years ago in quiet moments of uncertainty. The lyrics were soft but full of honesty. People closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Tears fell freely down cheeks. Hands clutched shoulders. Hearts lifted and settled in ways they had not known they could. Taylor sang not for fame, not for recognition, but because this was what music was meant to do. Minutes later, a volunteer from a local arts organization approached, nervously carrying a clipboard and envelope. Taylor nodded quietly and motioned for the crowd to stay calm. The volunteer began counting donations slowly and carefully. The clinking of coins, the rustling of bills became part of the background like another instrument. Every person watching held their breath, unsure what the total might be. The tension in the park was palpable. Finally, the envelope was lifted. Taylor's eyes scanned the faces around her. She smiled softly, knowing that whatever the number, it was more than just a figure. But when the total was spoken aloud, a stunned silence fell over everyone. $50,000. The guitar case had raised $50,000 in a single day. People froze, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Then a roar of applause erupted. Tears flowed openly. Strangers hugged each other tightly. Some shouted congratulations. Some wept quietly, overwhelmed with emotion. The performers surrounding Taylor cried openly. The drummer's hands shook. The violinist dropped her bow briefly to wipe her face. The saxophonist smiled through tears. They had spent years playing in silence, hoping someone might notice, and now this moment confirmed that someone not only noticed but believed in them. Taylor looked around at the group and nodded softly. Her voice trembled slightly as she said, "Thank you to everyone present. Thank you for believing, thank you for giving, thank you for being part of this moment." A young girl who had dropped coins in the case earlier ran forward again, holding a small note. She whispered thank you so quietly Taylor had to bend down to hear. Taylor knelt and smiled. She said softly that the smallest gesture carries the most meaning. The girl ran back to her mother, beaming with pride and wonder. Around them people shared small conversations about hope, about music, about life, about perseverance. The park was no longer just a park. It had become a sanctuary for joy and generosity. Taylor began to play again. Her fingers danced across the guitar chords gently but confidently. She sang songs of struggle and resilience. Songs that reminded people of the strength they carry inside. The crowd swayed and hummed along softly. The music became a bridge between generations, strangers and performers. Stories flowed silently between people who had never met before. Moments of recognition, laughter and tears created a tapestry that could not be measured by money or fame. The volunteers carefully secured the envelope with $50,000. Taylor nodded and motioned to the crowd that the funds would be distributed fairly to street performers across the city. There was no fanfare, just quiet dignity. The significance of the act hung in the air. It was not about the total alone but about the principle. Artists deserve recognition and support. People deserve moments that remind them of the beauty in humanity. As the final rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, Taylor played a song she had never performed publicly before. It was soft, melancholic yet full of hope. People closed their eyes and let the music fill the space. Tears rolled freely. Some whispered prayers softly. Others simply held each other in silence. Taylor's voice carried honesty in every note. She was present fully and entirely in the moment. By the time she finished the last verse, the park was quiet except for soft applause and murmurs of awe. The performers embraced one another and shared stories about struggle and dreams. Taylor smiled softly, knowing that the impact of today would live far beyond this park. $50,000 would support dreams. But more importantly, hearts had been touched. People had been reminded of the power of generosity and the importance of music as a connective force. As dusk settled, Taylor slowly packed her guitar. The crowd lingered for a few moments longer, not wanting to leave. Strangers exchanged final words of encouragement and gratitude. Children held hands with parents. Performers gave quiet nods of thanks. The air felt lighter, warmer somehow. Taylor walked slowly toward the exit of the park. No cameras followed. No one shouted. She left quietly, like she had arrived. The city swallowed her gently. The story of the day would spread across phones, social media, news articles. But the true magic lived in the people who had experienced it firsthand. People would remember not the fame or the headlines but the feeling of witnessing something genuine, something honest, something human. As night settled over Central Park, a gentle hush fell across the space. The last light of the sun filtered through the trees, casting long golden shadows on the ground. The crowd had thinned slowly, leaving only a few stragglers who lingered quietly, savoring the moment. Taylor knelt briefly by her guitar case, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. $50,000 had been raised, but the number alone did not capture the depth of what had been shared. Each coin and bill carried a story. Each face in the crowd carried emotion that would remain long after the day ended. She began to play one final song. The notes were soft and deliberate. The melody wandered like a river over smooth stones. Her voice carried the warmth of the afternoon and the solemnity of the approaching night. The few remaining people stopped to listen. Some closed their eyes. Some swayed gently. Even the cold air seemed to soften around the music. This song was a thank you. A blessing. A promise that the beauty of what had happened would not be forgotten. The performers who had joined her throughout the day gathered one last time. They shared quiet words and exchanged smiles full of understanding. The drummer tapped a soft rhythm on the case. The violinist played a single note slowly and the saxophonist added a gentle breath that floated over the chords. Together they created a final harmony that lingered in the park long after the last note faded. Taylor stood slowly and looked at the emptying paths. Children had gone home holding parents' hands. Elderly couples walked slowly toward the exits. The people who remained stood silently reflecting on what they had seen and felt. Taylor realized that this day was not about her fame. It was about humanity. It was about connection. It was about reminding people that music could heal, remind, and unite. She packed her guitar carefully and carried it like a treasure back through the park. The quiet night embraced her. Streetlights flickered on, gently illuminating the paths. The cool air carried a sense of completion. People whispered softly about the generosity and humility they had witnessed. Some of the performers stayed behind quietly making notes in their heads about what they could achieve next. They had been seen. They had been supported. They had been celebrated. Taylor walked slowly toward the city streets knowing that this memory would stay with her forever. The echo of voices and notes still lingered in the air like a soft perfume. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the hours of solitude, the moments of doubt, the nights spent writing songs that nobody might hear. All of it had led to this. A moment where music was pure and connection was real. Later that night she sat at home with her guitar beside her. The day played over in her mind like a slow movie. She wrote notes about the reactions of people, about the performers' faces and the small moments that would never appear in news stories. She wrote about the quiet power of generosity. She wrote about hope and resilience and the magic of showing up even when no one expects you to. Her hand ached from writing, yet her heart felt light, full and alive. The city outside hummed quietly. The memories of the day would live in subway stations, street corners, apartment windows and tiny park benches where performers might hear the story and feel inspired. Children would tell their friends about the woman with the guitar who had sung in the park and made people cry and smile. Adults would remember the lesson that even one person acting with kindness and honesty could create ripples far beyond imagination. Taylor leaned back and closed her eyes. She remembered the faces of the volunteers, the performers, the strangers. She remembered coins dropping softly into the guitar case and bills being placed with trembling hands. She remembered the quiet applause and the soft gasps and the tears rolling down faces she would never forget. Music had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had built bridges. It had healed. It had united. As she finally rose to rest, she knew that her journey as an artist had changed. Fame and awards would continue. Tours and albums would follow. But the memory of this day of singing for strangers in a quiet park without cameras or stages would remain the most important performance of her life. A day where hearts were touched, lives were changed, and music reminded the world of its power. And somewhere in the park, as night deepened, the guitar case sat quietly waiting for the next day, the next song, and the next artist ready to step forward and share a piece of themselves with the world. The echo of Taylor's voice still lingered in the trees, in the paths, in the hearts of people who had stopped to listen. It was a reminder that connection can be simple, genuine, and life-changing when shared freely. This was a day that would not be measured by charts or headlines, but by human lives touched by music, generosity, and courage. A day where a city paused to listen, a few performers felt seen, and one woman remembered the reason she had started singing in the first place.